Number 1. Mark Ciavarella. Before his name became synonymous with one of the most shocking judicial corruption scandals in U.S. history, Mark Ciavarella was a respected figure in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. Born and raised in the area, he was a local success story, a high school athlete turned lawyer, eventually elected as a judge in the Luzerne County Court of Common Pleas. Known for his stern approach to juvenile justice, Ciavarella styled himself as a no-nonsense figure. He prided himself on what he called zero-tolerance sentencing. To many in the community, it looked like he was just trying to keep kids out of trouble. But beneath that tough-on-crime exterior, something much darker was unfolding. Between 2003 and 2008, Judge Ciavarella presided over thousands of juvenile cases. Many of these were for minor offenses, kids accused of things like writing prank graffiti, shoplifting, or getting into school fights. But rather than assigning community service or counseling, Ciavarella regularly handed out harsh sentences that sent children straight to juvenile detention facilities. In many instances, those facilities were privately run. What the public didn't know at the time was that Ciavarella, along with another judge, Michael Conahan, had struck a secret deal with the operators of 2 private youth detention centers. In exchange for funneling children into these facilities, Ciavarella received millions of dollars in kickbacks. The total amount he took was estimated at $2.8 million. It was a scheme that quite literally turned justice into a profit machine, and the currency was the lives of children. The scandal began to unravel thanks to the persistence of civil rights organizations, concerned parents, and eventually, federal investigators. Some parents had started questioning why their children were being given such disproportionately severe sentences for such minor infractions. Advocacy groups took notice, and in time, a formal investigation was launched. By 2009, federal authorities had built a case. They uncovered a trail of bank transfers, real estate purchases, and hidden payments that linked Ciavarella and Conahan directly to the owners of the private detention centers. The payments had been disguised as finder's fees and business investments, but investigators determined the truth. This was a pay-to-incarcerate scheme that undermined the core of the American justice system. In early 2009, Ciavarella and Conahan were charged in federal court with a range of offenses, including racketeering, fraud, and money laundering. Initially, both men entered into plea agreements that would have seen them serve around 7 years in prison. But those deals fell apart when a judge rejected them, citing the egregious nature of the crimes. That meant the case would go to trial. During the trial, prosecutors laid out a damning narrative. They showed how Ciavarella had sentenced hundreds of juveniles to detention without proper legal representation, sometimes in hearings that lasted only a few minutes. The court heard from young adults who described how a momentary lapse in judgment as a teen had turned into years of trauma, depression, and lost opportunity, all because of a judge's backroom financial interests. In 2011, Mark Ciavarella was found guilty on 12 of the 39 counts brought against him, including racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. The presiding judge, in delivering the sentence, described Ciavarella's actions as a betrayal of the public trust. He is currently serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility and will not be eligible for release until well into his 80s. The fallout from the scandal was immense. Over 2,000 juvenile convictions were overturned. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court intervened to vacate the records of many of the young people affected. Lawsuits followed, and in 2022, Ciavarella was ordered to pay more than $200 million in damages to victims and their families. A largely symbolic figure, given that the money may never be collected, but a reflection of the scale of harm. Beyond the legal consequences, the Kids for Cash case became a cautionary tale of how unchecked power and private profit motives can corrupt even the most essential parts of public service. It sparked national outrage, prompted documentaries, and led to widespread reforms in Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system. Lawmakers reevaluated the role of private prisons, especially in juvenile detention, and activists renewed their push for legal protections for minors in court. To this day, the scandal remains one of the most disturbing examples of institutional abuse of power in modern American history. Mark Ciavarella had been entrusted with the futures of children, some as young as 11 years old. Instead of guiding them toward rehabilitation, he saw them as a revenue stream. Looking back, the story of Mark Ciavarella is not just about a corrupt judge. It's a reminder of what can happen when accountability is ignored and when justice is treated as a commodity. The damage left behind cannot be undone, but it did shine a powerful light on a system in desperate need of scrutiny. Number 2. Michael Conahan. Michael Conahan once held one of the most powerful judicial roles in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. As the president judge of the Court of Common Pleas, Conahan had significant influence, not just over individual cases, but over the county's entire judicial budget and infrastructure. A former police officer turned attorney and then judge, he was seen by many as a polished and authoritative figure. Within the courthouse, he carried a reputation for being calculating and politically savvy. But behind the scenes, Conahan was helping orchestrate one of the most devastating judicial corruption schemes in American history. Conahan's role in what came to be known as the Kids for Cash scandal went beyond just rubber-stamping decisions. He was a central architect. While his co-conspirator, Judge Mark Ciavarella, handled the sentencing of juveniles, Conahan worked behind the curtain, laying the foundation that made the scheme possible. In the early 2000s, Conahan used his administrative power to defund the county's existing public juvenile detention center. He declared the facility unfit, pushing for its closure. That move effectively left the county with no alternative but to contract with a newly built private detention facility, owned and operated by businessmen with whom Conahan had a covert financial agreement. Together with Ciavarella, he helped secure millions of dollars in county contracts for the private facility, all while accepting a share of the illegal kickbacks that flowed from the deal. Over the span of several years, Conahan received payments funneled through shell companies and real estate ventures. The total scheme generated at least $2.8 million in illicit funds between the two judges. Meanwhile, children as young as 11 or 12 were being sentenced to months, sometimes years, in detention centers for low-level offenses, many without proper legal representation. The plan operated in the shadows for years, but slowly, cracks began to show. Parents started questioning the severity of the punishments their children were receiving. Civil rights organizations raised red flags about the unusually high incarceration rates among juveniles in Luzerne County. And by 2007, a formal investigation was underway. Federal authorities began unraveling the financial ties between the judges and the private facility operators. It wasn't long before the evidence pointed directly to Conahan and Ciavarella. Bank records, wire transfers, and property holdings revealed the extent of the conspiracy. The judges had gone to great lengths to hide the money, laundering it through intermediaries and hiding behind paperwork that made it look like legitimate investments. In January 2009, the scheme came to light in full when both judges were charged with honest services fraud and tax-related offenses. Prosecutors alleged that Conahan had leveraged his administrative position to eliminate public alternatives, ensuring that the county had no choice but to rely on the private facility that was lining his pockets. At first, Conahan agreed to a plea deal, admitting his role in the conspiracy and accepting a prison sentence. The initial agreement called for a reduced sentence of about 7 years. But when details of the full scheme were revealed, particularly how many children had been affected, the judge overseeing the case rejected the deal, stating it was far too lenient given the severity of the crimes. Unlike Ciavarella, who went to trial and was convicted, Conahan ultimately accepted responsibility and entered a new guilty plea. In September 2011, he was sentenced to 17 and a half years in federal prison. He began serving his sentence at a correctional facility in Florida, far from the Pennsylvania courtroom where his crimes had been committed. But in 2020, Conahan's time behind bars was unexpectedly cut short. Amid the spread of COVID-19 in the federal prison system, he was granted compassionate release and placed on home confinement. The decision drew criticism, especially from victims' families and advocates who felt the full consequences of his actions had not been served. As of today, Conahan remains under supervised release and is no longer eligible to return to public office or legal practice. The consequences of the Kids for Cash scandal didn't end with prison sentences. The fallout was far-reaching. Thousands of juvenile convictions were overturned, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court took unprecedented steps to clear the records of affected minors. Several civil lawsuits were filed against both judges, as well as the businessmen who operated the private detention centers. In one landmark judgment, Conahan and Ciavarella were ordered to pay over $200 million in damages, an amount more symbolic than recoverable, but reflective of the scale of the harm done. The scandal led to sweeping reforms in the juvenile justice system, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the United States. Lawmakers and activists called for greater oversight of judges, stricter controls over private prison contracts, and stronger protections for juveniles in court. The case became a focal point in debates over the privatization of justice and the dangers of blending profit with punishment. Michael Conahan's legacy is now cemented not by the years he spent on the bench, but by the lives his decisions helped derail. Unlike many corruption cases, this one had a human cost that extended far beyond the financial. For hundreds of families, the damage wasn't just legal, it was emotional, psychological, and deeply personal. The story of Michael Conahan stands as a cautionary tale about the corrupting force of power when left unchecked. It's a reminder that in the justice system, even a single individual, when guided by personal gain instead of public service, can leave a lasting scar on an entire community. Number 3. Lance Mason. Lance Mason once stood at the pinnacle of public life in Ohio. A former state senator and a sitting judge in Cuyahoga County, Mason had the kind of resume that suggested trust, leadership, and stability. Educated at the University of Michigan and the University of Michigan Law School, he served as an assistant prosecutor, a state legislator, and later a judge on the Court of Common Pleas. To many, Mason represented the promise of a dignified legal mind dedicated to justice and reform. But behind the title and the tailored suits, there was a different story, one that would eventually erupt into one of the most tragic and disturbing cases of domestic violence in recent memory. In 2014, Mason was arrested following a violent altercation with his wife, Aisha Fraser. According to police reports, Mason punched Aisha repeatedly while driving with their children in the back seat. The attack was severe enough to cause facial fractures that required reconstructive surgery. When officers searched his home, they found a stockpile of weapons and ammunition, dozens of firearms, smoke grenades, a bulletproof vest, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. It was clear this wasn't a one-time incident. It was the culmination of a deeply troubled relationship marked by control and abuse. Mason was convicted of domestic violence and sentenced to 2 years in prison. He served just 9 months. Upon release, he was disbarred and barred from holding public office again. But despite the severity of the 2014 assault, Mason soon found himself back in the political fold. In a controversial decision, the city of Cleveland hired him in 2017 as the Minority Business Development Director, sparking public backlash and concern over how someone with a known history of domestic violence could return to a city leadership role. Then, in November 2018, the story took a fatal turn. On a quiet Saturday morning, police were called to Aisha Frazier's home in the Shaker Heights suburb. What they found was shocking. Aisha, a beloved elementary school teacher and mother of two, had been stabbed to death outside her home. Witnesses reported that Mason had attacked her in the driveway, in full view of their children, then fled the scene in her vehicle. Not long after, he crashed into a police cruiser and was arrested while attempting to flee on foot. Investigators quickly confirmed that Mason was the sole suspect. It was a premeditated act. Prosecutors later revealed that Mason had been waiting for Aisha to drop off their children, seizing the opportunity to confront and ultimately kill her. The community was devastated. This wasn't just a high-profile case of domestic violence. It was a brutal escalation from a former judge who had once been sworn to uphold the law. The legal proceedings that followed moved quickly. Mason was charged with aggravated murder and other related offenses. In August 2019, he pleaded guilty to all charges as part of a deal to avoid the death penalty. The courtroom was filled with members of the community, former colleagues, and Aisha's family, who spoke of the lasting trauma and irreversible loss his actions had caused. The judge sentenced Lance Mason to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 35 years. At his sentencing, the court made it clear that Mason's background as a legal professional made the crime all the more appalling. He had known the consequences, had seen the aftermath of violent crime firsthand, and still chose to commit it. As of now, Mason is serving his sentence in an Ohio state prison. He will be eligible for parole in the 2050s, when he is in his late 80s. His name, once associated with public service and legal scholarship, is now forever linked to one of the most high-profile cases of domestic violence in Ohio's history. The impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. Aisha Frazier's death became a rallying point for advocates of domestic violence prevention. Her colleagues and students at Woodbury Elementary School mourned the loss of a dedicated teacher. Community leaders called for stricter protections for survivors, and questions were raised about the decision to rehire Mason after his initial conviction. In many ways, it exposed gaps in how society handles known abusers, especially when they occupy positions of influence. The case also reignited debates around the parole system, judicial accountability, and how former public officials are treated by the institutions they once served. For many, it served as a grim reminder that status and education are not safeguards against violence, and that ignoring red flags, especially in domestic settings, can lead to irreversible tragedy. In the years since, Aisha Frazier's legacy has lived on through memorials, scholarship funds, and educational initiatives. Her story became a symbol, not just of loss, but of resilience and advocacy in the face of injustice. Meanwhile, Mason's fall from grace remains one of the most jarring in recent U.S. judicial history. A man who once held the gavel, who had the power to determine the fates of others, ultimately chose to destroy his own. At its core, the story of Lance Mason is not just a tale of a violent crime, it's a case study in failure. A failure of character, of accountability, and of the systems that allowed a known abuser to return to power. It's a sobering reminder of what can happen when warning signs go unheeded, and when the people meant to protect others use their power to do harm. Number 4. Sonya McKnight. In early 2025, headlines across Pennsylvania lit up with a story that felt almost surreal. A sitting magistrate judge, someone entrusted with upholding the law, was convicted of attempted homicide. The name at the center of it all was Sonya McKnight, a woman who had once represented the face of justice in Dauphin County. But this time, she wasn't behind the bench. She was in handcuffs. Sonya McKnight had served as a magisterial district judge in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where she presided over lower-level criminal cases and civil disputes. She was known in the courtroom for her calm demeanor and confident presence. Colleagues described her as professional, principled, and, at times, deeply compassionate. She was also a former police officer, someone with decades of experience in law enforcement. On paper, McKnight seemed like the last person you'd expect to be involved in a violent crime. But the facade began to crack on a quiet night in February 2023. That evening, McKnight drove to the Harrisburg home of her former boyfriend, a man with whom she had a long and complicated romantic history. According to court testimony, the two had recently broken off a tumultuous relationship. Neighbors later reported hearing a single loud noise, then silence. When first responders arrived, they found the man inside the house with a gunshot wound to the head. Remarkably, he was still alive. He was rushed to the hospital and survived, though with lasting injuries. In his initial statements, he identified McKnight as the shooter. Authorities launched a full investigation, and within days, McKnight was arrested and charged with attempted homicide. The arrest sent shockwaves through the legal community. Not only was a sitting judge facing one of the most serious criminal charges possible, she was accused of nearly killing someone she had once loved. As investigators began piecing together the events of that night, they also uncovered a history of conflict between McKnight and the victim. While no restraining orders had been filed, text messages and witness accounts suggested there had been tension following the end of their relationship. Prosecutors argued that the shooting was premeditated, pointing to McKnight's decision to visit the home uninvited, with a loaded weapon in her possession. From the beginning, McKnight denied the charges. Her defense argued that the shooting was accidental, that the firearm had discharged during a confrontation, and that there had been no intent to kill. They highlighted her clean criminal record, years of public service, and strong community ties. But the prosecution painted a different picture, that of a trained former officer and judge who fully understood the consequences of her actions. The case went to trial in early 2025. Media coverage was intense, particularly given McKnight's role within the judiciary. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but daily reports chronicled every development. Witnesses included first responders, neighbors, and the victim himself, who, despite memory issues stemming from the injury, testified that McKnight had come to his home and shot him deliberately. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning a verdict, guilty of attempted homicide. The court also found her guilty of several related charges, including aggravated assault and firearms violations. The sentencing was just as closely watched. In a packed courtroom, McKnight was sentenced to 13.5 to 30 years in state prison. Given the seriousness of the offense and her background in law enforcement and the judiciary, the judge emphasized the breach of public trust in the decision. McKnight was immediately taken into custody and transported to a state correctional facility. Her law license was revoked, and her position on the bench was vacated. At age 57, she now faces the possibility of spending the remainder of her life behind bars, depending on parole outcomes. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some expressed disbelief that someone who had dedicated so much of her life to public safety could be capable of such violence. Others pointed to the pressures and personal struggles that may have contributed to the crime, calling for more attention to mental health within the legal profession. For the legal system in Pennsylvania, it was a black eye, another reminder that no one is immune from accountability, regardless of their title or background. The case also sparked broader conversations about judicial oversight. McKnight had continued serving on the bench for nearly a year after the incident while under investigation. That raised questions about how judges are disciplined or suspended during pending criminal cases, and whether reforms are needed to prevent similar situations from happening again. For the victim and his family, the sentence brought some sense of closure, but not without pain. The physical and emotional toll of the shooting left permanent scars. In statements to the media, he said he hoped the case would encourage other survivors of domestic violence to come forward, regardless of who their abuser may be. Sonya McKnight's fall from grace is one of the most recent and startling examples of how even those who are sworn to uphold the law can cross the line in devastating ways. A once respected judge now living behind prison walls. A moment of violence that changed 2 lives forever. And a community left to reconcile the image of who she was with the reality of what she did. Number 5. Thomas J. Maloney. In the tangled web of Chicago's political history, the 1980s were a time when whispers of corruption weren't just rumors, they were routine. Nowhere was that more evident than in the city's courtrooms, where justice was often influenced not by facts, but by favors. And at the center of one of the most explosive corruption investigations in U.S. judicial history stood Judge Thomas J. Maloney. Maloney wasn't just any judge. He presided over serious felony cases in Cook County, including multiple murder trials. Appointed in 1977, he was known as a tough, authoritative figure on the bench. He had previously worked as a criminal defense attorney, representing clients from all walks of life, including those tied to organized crime. To many, he was a no-nonsense judge who brought control to a chaotic docket. But behind the scenes, Maloney was operating on a very different kind of system, one where outcomes could be bought, and verdicts came with a price tag. The scheme was part of a much larger investigation by the FBI known as Operation Greylord. It was an ambitious and far-reaching sting operation that exposed widespread corruption within the Cook County court system. Agents went undercover, posing as attorneys, and used wiretaps and hidden recording devices to document how deep the rot had spread. Maloney's role in the scandal was among the most serious. Prosecutors alleged that he had accepted bribes to fix multiple cases, including at least 3 murder trials. The payments were funneled through intermediaries, usually corrupt lawyers or court clerks, who passed along cash in exchange for favorable rulings. In some cases, witnesses were discredited, evidence was suppressed, and defendants walked free. All of it hidden beneath the veneer of judicial authority. The most notorious example involved a 1981 murder trial in which 2 members of a street gang were accused of killing rival gang members. Maloney allegedly accepted $100,000 to ensure an acquittal. Despite strong evidence, the defendants were found not guilty. Years later, one of them confessed in a separate case, adding fuel to the growing investigation into Maloney's conduct. By the late 1980s, the FBI had enough evidence to move forward. After years of surveillance and careful coordination, Maloney was indicted in 1991 on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion. The trial that followed would mark a defining moment in the Greylord saga. Unlike many other judges who had quietly pleaded guilty or resigned under pressure, Maloney fought the charges. He insisted he had never accepted a bribe and that the government's case was based on lies. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, wiretaps, and paper trails all pointed to a systematic abuse of power. One cooperating attorney testified that Maloney accepted bribes routinely and that fixing trials was just part of doing business. In 1993, Maloney was convicted on multiple counts, including fixing 3 murder cases. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences handed down to a judge in the Operation Greylord investigation. He began serving his sentence shortly after, eventually spending 12 years behind bars before his release in 2007. His disbarment was automatic, and his legacy became a cautionary tale. While more than 90 officials were indicted during Greylord, including judges, prosecutors, and police officers, Maloney's case stood out for one reason. He had manipulated the outcome of trials where lives were on the line. This wasn't just about parking tickets or political favors. It was about people charged with murder being allowed to walk free because someone had the right cash in hand. Maloney's downfall further exposed how deeply embedded corruption had become in Chicago's judicial system. For years, it had operated like an open secret, known to lawyers, tolerated by some, and feared by those who felt powerless to change it. Operation Greylord pulled back the curtain, showing just how vulnerable the justice system could be when integrity gave way to greed. The public reaction was one of anger, but also resignation. For decades, Chicago had carried a reputation for political corruption, but seeing it unfold in courtrooms, where people's futures were supposed to be decided fairly, hit differently. It led to calls for reform, including the creation of oversight commissions, mandatory ethics training, and stronger protections for whistleblowers. In the years after his release, Maloney lived in relative obscurity, largely avoiding public comment on his case. He passed away in 2008, just 1 year after his release. He never publicly expressed remorse. Today, Thomas J. Maloney's name is frequently cited in law schools, investigative reports, and ethics seminars as a textbook example of judicial corruption. His story has been featured in documentaries and books examining the darker chapters of American legal history. It's a reminder that when the gatekeepers of justice themselves become compromised, the consequences echo far beyond the courtroom. The Maloney case didn't just end a career, it shattered faith in a system that relies entirely on impartiality and trust. The robe, the gavel, the bench, all are symbols of fairness. But in the hands of someone like Maloney, they became tools in a transactional scheme where money talked louder than evidence. In the end, Operation Greylord achieved its goal of bringing accountability to a broken system. But the story of Thomas J. Maloney remains a powerful warning. Corruption rarely starts with a single act. It grows in silence, thrives in complacency, and only stops when someone decides enough is enough. Number 6. Ronald Bodenheimer. In the early 2000s, Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, was home to a well-connected judge who seemed to have it all: political influence, public respect, and a firm seat on the bench. Judge Ronald Bodenheimer had once served as a prosecutor before winning election to the bench in the 24th Judicial District Court. He was known for his sharp legal mind and tough rulings. But what no one expected, what no one could have imagined, was that the very man trusted to deliver justice was secretly undermining it behind closed doors. Bodenheimer's fall from grace was sudden, but it didn't come out of nowhere. There were warning signs, whispers in the legal community, complaints from citizens, and questionable decisions that raised eyebrows. Still, few believed a sitting judge could be involved in something truly criminal. That changed in 2001, when federal investigators launched an undercover probe into corruption within Jefferson Parish's court system. The operation, originally targeting broader political misconduct, quickly zeroed in on Bodenheimer. As it turned out, the judge had been engaging in a wide-ranging scheme involving favors for campaign donors, abuse of his office, and, in one of the most disturbing episodes, planting drugs to frame a critic. The case that would bring everything crashing down began with a local marina owner named Eric Mammal. Mammal had long accused Bodenheimer of abusing his judicial position to benefit his own business interests. At the time, Bodenheimer owned a seafood business and had a clear financial stake in certain regulatory decisions. When Mammal spoke out, he didn't just attract legal pressure, he became a target. According to federal prosecutors, Bodenheimer conspired with 2 of his associates to have drugs planted in Mammal's possession. The plan was simple: make it look like Mammal was a criminal, and discredit his complaints. A package of oxycodone was hidden in a toolbox on Mammal's property. Bodenheimer then arranged for law enforcement to discover it. But the plan fell apart when an honest officer spotted inconsistencies in the call and reported it. What was intended to be a quick takedown of a nuisance citizen turned into a serious red flag for federal investigators. As the probe deepened, authorities uncovered a much broader pattern of misconduct. Bodenheimer had accepted gifts and campaign donations in exchange for favorable rulings. In one case, he was accused of reducing sentences or dropping charges in return for political favors. He had also pressured the local district attorney's office to pursue cases that benefited his business allies. All of it pointed to a judge who saw the courtroom not as a sacred place of law, but as a tool for personal and political gain. In 2003, Bodenheimer was indicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit bribery, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice. He initially denied the allegations, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Wiretaps, witness testimony, and documentation of the planted drugs all made a clear case. Facing the prospect of a long prison sentence if convicted at trial, Bodenheimer entered a guilty plea. In federal court, he admitted to conspiring to frame Eric Mammel and to misusing his position to influence legal outcomes. The judge overseeing the case described Bodenheimer's actions as a profound betrayal of public trust. In 2004, he was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison, just under 4 years. He served his time at a federal correctional facility and was released in 2008. Upon his release, he was permanently disbarred and stripped of all public honors or entitlements connected to his former position. Unlike others caught up in political scandals, Bodenheimer didn't attempt a return to public life. His name became synonymous with judicial misconduct in Louisiana, and his case was widely cited in efforts to increase judicial transparency across the state. The broader fallout of the scandal was significant. Bodenheimer's conviction triggered a wave of internal reviews within the state judiciary, and Jefferson Parish saw a renewed push for ethics reform. Citizens and advocacy groups called for stronger checks on judicial power, better protection for whistleblowers, and a more rigorous process for removing judges accused of misconduct. For Eric Mammel, the marina owner who had nearly been framed, the ordeal brought both vindication and trauma. He later testified about the chilling realization that a judge, someone with immense power, had tried to destroy his life using the justice system itself. His case became a symbol of how dangerously personal justice can become when unchecked power is allowed to fester. The story of Ronald Bodenheimer doesn't involve millions of dollars or international headlines, but in many ways, it's even more disturbing. It's the story of a judge who tried to weaponize the very laws he swore to uphold, all to silence a critic and serve his own interests. And it's a reminder that corruption isn't always flashy or dramatic. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, disguised by robes and titles. In the years since, the case has faded somewhat from public memory. But within legal circles, Bodenheimer's name still lingers, attached to lessons about ethics, accountability, and the fragile nature of public trust. The bench he once sat on has long since been filled by someone new, but the stain left behind serves as a lasting warning of what can happen when ambition overtakes principle. Number 7. Gerald Garson. Divorce court is supposed to be one of the last places where fairness truly matters. Emotions run high, families are reshaped, and the decisions made by a judge can impact lives for decades. But in Brooklyn, New York, during the early 2000s, one Supreme Court justice was quietly turning those life-altering decisions into a cash business. Gerald Garson served as a matrimonial judge in the New York State Supreme Court, presiding over bitter divorce disputes, custody battles, and child support hearings. To the average person, Garson's courtroom represented authority and resolution. But behind closed doors, he was running a system where judicial rulings could be influenced, if the price was right. Born and raised in New York, Garson had built a long career in law. He was appointed to the bench in the 1990s and was seen as experienced, capable, and even-tempered. But his time in matrimonial court exposed him to a niche where emotions and money were closely intertwined. And eventually, it was revealed that he had been accepting gifts, cash, and favors in exchange for issuing favorable rulings in divorce cases. The scheme wasn't particularly complex, but it was remarkably brazen. Garson had established an informal relationship with a divorce attorney named Paul Simonovsky. According to investigators, Simonovsky would funnel cash payments, luxury items, and meals to Garson. In return, the judge would provide legal tips, steer cases in Simonovsky's direction, and even allow the attorney to handpick referees, those responsible for making key pretrial recommendations. In some cases, Garson allegedly made private phone calls with Simonovsky to discuss how best to manipulate court schedules or delay certain motions to benefit his client. It was, essentially, a pay-to-play system masquerading as legitimate legal procedure. But things began to unravel in 2002 when a litigant involved in a contentious divorce suspected something wasn't right. She believed the opposing counsel was receiving unusually favorable treatment. That suspicion reached the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, which launched a quiet but targeted investigation into Garson's courtroom practices. What followed was a carefully planned sting operation. Authorities wired Simonovsky with a hidden recording device and instructed him to continue his dealings with Garson as usual. The resulting audio and video evidence painted a damning picture of judicial misconduct. Garson could be heard offering coaching, expressing frustration with opposing lawyers, and even discussing how to manipulate proceedings, all while accepting bribes in various forms. In 2003, Judge Garson was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including bribery, receiving rewards for official misconduct, and receiving unlawful gratuities. The charges sent shockwaves through New York's legal community. This wasn't a minor administrative failure. It was a Supreme Court justice accused of selling justice to the highest bidder. At trial, Garson's defense team argued that his relationship with Simonovsky had been more of a friendship gone too far, and that the perks he received were gestures of appreciation rather than outright bribes. But the recordings told a different story, one of calculated corruption and repeated abuse of judicial authority. In 2007, after a lengthy legal process, Gerald Garson was convicted. He was sentenced to serve between 3 and 10 years in state prison. He began his sentence at the Hudson Correctional Facility and served approximately 2.5 years before being released on parole in late 2009. The scandal didn't end with Garson's incarceration. In its wake, public outrage fueled widespread calls for reform. The idea that a judge in one of New York's highest courts could be so easily compromised forced the state to take a hard look at how its judiciary was monitored. Almost immediately, New York's Office of Court Administration introduced stricter rules on judicial conduct, increased ethics training, and improved transparency in case assignments, especially in the high-stakes world of family court. For litigants who had passed through Garson's courtroom, the case cast a long shadow. Custody decisions, support rulings, and even final divorce judgments were suddenly open to scrutiny. Several parties petitioned for their cases to be reviewed or reopened, arguing that they had been denied a fair hearing. Meanwhile, the scandal tarnished the reputation of New York's judiciary in the eyes of the public. Editorials in major newspapers questioned whether Garson's case was an isolated incident, or the tip of a much larger problem. The state's Commission on Judicial Conduct reported a spike in complaints following the case, suggesting that Garson's exposure had emboldened others to come forward with concerns about unethical behavior on the bench. Even within the legal community, the Garson case became a flashpoint for debate about campaign donations, judicial elections, and the blurred lines between professional relationships and conflicts of interest. In the years since his release, Gerald Garson has remained out of the public eye. Disbarred and disgraced, he left behind a courtroom where trust had been broken, and a legal system forced to repair itself under intense scrutiny. Ultimately, the story of Gerald Garson isn't just about one corrupt judge. It's about how fragile fairness can be when power is unchecked. When people walk into a courtroom, they're often at their most vulnerable, hoping for clarity in the middle of chaos. What Garson did was betray that hope for profit. His conviction served as a turning point in New York judicial history. But the deeper lesson it left behind is one that still resonates today. Justice only works when it's blind, to wealth, to influence, and especially to personal gain. Number 8. Samuel B. Kent. In the world of federal courts, judges tend to stay out of the spotlight. Their decisions shape lives, laws, and institutions, but their names rarely make the front page. That made the case of Judge Samuel B. Kent all the more jarring. When a sitting federal judge is not only accused of serious misconduct, but also impeached, convicted, and sent to prison, it's not just a scandal. It's history in the making. Samuel Kent served as a U.S. District Judge for the Southern District of Texas, having been appointed in 1990 by President George H.W. Bush. For nearly 2 decades, he presided over civil and criminal cases out of the Galveston Division. Known for his sharp intellect and at times abrasive demeanor, Kent built a reputation as a tough but efficient jurist. Behind the bench, he carried significant power, and over time, it became clear that he had begun abusing it in deeply disturbing ways. The first public signs of trouble came in 2007, when court employees raised allegations of sexual misconduct. 2 women, both court staff members, came forward with serious accusations. They claimed that Kent had groped them, made inappropriate sexual advances, and used his position to intimidate them into silence. The allegations pointed to a pattern of harassment that had allegedly been occurring over a span of years, with Kent leveraging his authority to make victims feel powerless. The complaints triggered an internal investigation by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which had oversight over Kent's jurisdiction. Initially, the court reassigned Kent to Houston and issued a 4-month suspension, citing judicial misconduct. But the accusations didn't go away, and federal authorities soon took the matter further. In August 2008, Kent was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of abusive sexual contact and attempted aggravated sexual abuse. The charges stemmed from his behavior toward 2 specific employees, his former case manager and his secretary. Prosecutors alleged that Kent had repeatedly forced himself on the women in private settings, often in chambers, where no witnesses were present, and the power dynamic was completely one-sided. As the legal process unfolded, Kent publicly denied any criminal wrongdoing. But as more evidence surfaced, including sworn statements and corroborating testimony, it became clear that a plea deal was likely his only option. In February 2009, Kent pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice. Prosecutors agreed to drop the more serious sex-related charges, but in exchange, Kent admitted that he had lied to a judicial investigative committee in an attempt to cover up his conduct. He was sentenced to 33 months in federal prison and ordered to pay a $1,000 fine. Kent became the first sitting federal judge in decades to be sentenced to prison for a felony. But the legal consequences didn't stop there. Even after sentencing, Kent initially refused to resign from the bench. That meant he was still technically a federal judge, entitled to a salary and pension benefits. His refusal sparked outrage from lawmakers, advocacy groups, and the public. The idea that a convicted felon could remain on the federal payroll while sitting in prison was unacceptable to many. Congress took swift action. In June 2009, the House of Representatives passed 4 articles of impeachment against Kent, citing sexual assault, obstruction of justice, and abuse of office. It was a rare and dramatic move. Judicial impeachments in the U.S. are exceedingly uncommon. Kent became only the 14th federal judge in American history to be impeached. Facing a Senate trial, Kent finally resigned, just days before the process was set to begin. His resignation officially ended his judicial career and cut off his benefits. It was the final chapter in a case that had already rocked the federal judiciary. Kent served his sentence at a federal prison in Devens, Massachusetts, and was released in July 2011 after completing a little over 2 years. Since his release, he has remained largely out of the public eye. Disbarred and disgraced, he no longer holds any legal or political influence. The impact of the Kent case was both symbolic and procedural. Symbolic in that it sent a clear message that even the most powerful judges could be held accountable for their actions. and procedural, in that it exposed loopholes in how federal judges are monitored, investigated, and, when necessary, removed. At the time, many critics argued that the initial internal investigation had been too lenient, and that the broader judicial system lacked the mechanisms needed to swiftly deal with high-ranking misconduct. Kent's attempt to delay his resignation after conviction further fueled efforts to reform judicial ethics oversight and improve the transparency of misconduct investigations. For the women who came forward, the case was both painful and vindicating. They endured scrutiny, backlash, and the weight of challenging someone at the very top of the judicial hierarchy. But their actions ultimately led to one of the few successful impeachments of a federal judge in modern U.S. history. The story of Samuel B. Kent stands as a stark reminder that judicial authority is not a shield against consequences. Even at the federal level, where lifetime appointments offer enormous independence, abuse of power can and will be challenged, especially when it violates the trust placed in the courts by the public. In the end, Kent's case wasn't just about individual wrongdoing. It was about systemic responsibility and the courage it takes to demand accountability from those entrusted with the law itself. Number 9. Jack Tarpley Camp Jr. It's one thing for a judge to break the law. It's another entirely when the crimes committed mirror the very cases he was actively presiding over in court. That's what made the fall of federal judge Jack Tarpley Camp Jr. not just shocking, but surreal. Camp served as a senior judge on the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. Appointed by President Ronald Reagan in 1987, he spent over 2 decades on the bench handling high-profile federal cases, including drug offenses and firearms violations. He was known as a strict enforcer of federal sentencing laws, particularly when it came to narcotics. But in 2010, his own personal life revealed a disturbing double standard. That year, Camp was arrested after a months-long investigation exposed a secret life that stood in direct contradiction to everything he represented in court. According to federal authorities, Camp had been involved in an ongoing relationship with a stripper, one that involved not only sexual exchanges, but repeated illegal drug use and unlawful possession of firearms. The relationship began earlier that year when Camp reportedly met the woman at an Atlanta strip club. Over time, it evolved into something darker. He began purchasing and using cocaine, marijuana, and prescription painkillers with her. On several occasions, he even brought his government-issued handgun along while under the influence. These weren't isolated incidents. Court records show he used drugs with the woman multiple times and even asked her to help him obtain more. Eventually, the woman became a confidential informant for the FBI. She wore a wire and recorded several meetings with Camp, during which he made arrangements to buy drugs, spoke openly about using them, and even offered to share controlled substances. In one instance, Camp handed her cash to purchase narcotics from an undercover agent. All the while, he was carrying his loaded firearm, committing a felony simply by possessing it while on drugs. The arrest happened in October 2010. Camp was taken into custody in a sting operation after making another illegal drug purchase. At the time, the news stunned both the legal community and the public. This was a sitting federal judge, a Reagan appointee, caught purchasing cocaine and prescription pills in the company of someone he was not only involved with, but who he knew had a criminal record. Federal prosecutors wasted no time in filing charges. Camp was indicted on multiple counts, including unlawful possession of controlled substances, possession of a firearm during drug use, and aiding and abetting the distribution of illegal drugs. Perhaps most seriously, he was also charged with attempting to obstruct justice, because during his relationship with the informant, he accessed court databases to look up her prior cases and used that information inappropriately. When the case went public, Camp resigned from the bench almost immediately. It marked an abrupt end to a judicial career that had spanned more than 20 years. Facing overwhelming evidence, he entered a guilty plea in 2011, admitting to 2 drug-related misdemeanors and 1 felony count of aiding and abetting possession of controlled substances with intent to distribute. During sentencing, Camp's legal team painted a picture of a man in crisis. They claimed he had been struggling with depression, had suffered a traumatic brain injury years earlier in a biking accident, and had become emotionally vulnerable following the death of his father. While these factors may have explained his actions, they didn't excuse them. The judge overseeing the case emphasized that Camp had willfully abused his position and showed a clear disregard for the laws he once enforced. He was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison and was disbarred soon after. Camp served his sentence and was released in 2013. His attempts to return to legal practice in any form were blocked. The fallout was complete. His reputation, career, and legacy permanently dismantled. The Camp case became a flashpoint for discussions about judicial accountability, mental health, and ethics. Some saw it as a cautionary tale of unchecked personal decline. Others pointed to it as evidence of the enormous power judges hold, and how dangerous it can be when that power goes unmonitored for too long. One of the most difficult aspects of the case for many observers was the glaring hypocrisy. Camp had spent years handing down lengthy sentences to defendants accused of the same crimes he eventually committed. He had ruled over federal drug and firearms cases, often with a hardline stance. That contrast between what he said in court and what he did outside of it left a sour taste for those who believe in equal justice. In the broader judicial system, Camp's downfall contributed to renewed calls for greater oversight of federal judges. Because of their lifetime appointments, federal judges are subject to less scrutiny than other public officials. And while most serve honorably, cases like Camp's highlight the need for ongoing monitoring, ethics training, and transparent disciplinary procedures. Jack Tarpley Camp Jr. is now one of the few federal judges in U.S. history to be convicted of a felony. His case didn't involve political corruption or bribery, but instead revealed something more personal: how even those entrusted with the law can lose their way, and how unchecked behavior can spiral into criminality. For the public, the case served as a wake-up call. Judges are human, but when that humanity turns into misconduct, especially of the kind that endangers public trust, the consequences must be swift and clear. Number 10. Tracie Hunter. Few judicial cases in recent memory have divided public opinion as sharply, or as emotionally, as that of Judge Tracie Hunter. Once hailed as a trailblazer in Hamilton County, Ohio, she later became the focus of a deeply polarizing legal and political battle, one that blurred the lines between ethics, race, power, and accountability. Tracie Hunter was elected in 2010 as a juvenile court judge, becoming the first African-American woman to hold that position in Hamilton County. A former television news producer turned attorney, Hunter campaigned on promises of reform, transparency, and fairness in the juvenile justice system. After a lengthy and contested election process, including a court-ordered recount, she finally took the bench in 2012. From the beginning, her tenure was marked by conflict. Hunter frequently clashed with other judges and officials over court operations and personnel matters. Her supporters saw her as someone challenging a system resistant to change. Her critics accused her of refusing to follow administrative protocol and disrupting the functioning of the court. But the controversy intensified in 2013 when she was indicted on multiple felony counts, charges that would ultimately end her judicial career. The case centered on a decision Hunter made involving her brother, Stephen Hunter, who worked as a corrections officer at the county's juvenile detention center. At the time, he was under investigation for allegedly striking a juvenile detainee. According to prosecutors, Judge Hunter improperly used her position to access and share confidential documents related to the case, specifically an internal memo that could potentially help her brother defend himself against disciplinary action. The indictment included 9 felony charges, ranging from tampering with evidence to theft in office. But only one charge stuck: unlawful interest in a public contract. Prosecutors argued that by intervening in her brother's employment situation, she had used her office to influence a public contract in which she had a family interest, something explicitly forbidden under Ohio law. Hunter's trial began in 2014 and quickly became a media spectacle. The courtroom was often packed with observers, and outside, protests grew larger by the day. Her legal team claimed she had done nothing illegal, that she had merely tried to ensure her brother received fair treatment in a system that was already biased against them both. Prosecutors, meanwhile, insisted that her actions represented a clear abuse of judicial authority. The jury ultimately found her guilty on 1 count. The remaining charges either resulted in a hung jury or were dismissed. The conviction alone was enough to mandate her removal from office, and she was disbarred shortly afterward. But what came next ensured the case would remain in national headlines. Though she was sentenced to 6 months in jail in 2014, a series of appeals and legal maneuvers delayed her incarceration for nearly 5 years. During that time, Hunter maintained a high public profile. She spoke at rallies, attended community events, and continued to argue that the case against her had been politically and racially motivated. Her supporters believed she was being punished for challenging the status quo, particularly in a county with a history of racial tension in its justice system. In July 2019, after exhausting all legal appeals, Tracie Hunter was ordered to begin serving her sentence. The courtroom was tense. As the judge read the ruling, Hunter remained seated. When bailiffs moved to take her into custody, she went limp and refused to walk. What followed was a scene caught on camera and broadcast nationwide. Hunter being dragged out of the courtroom by her arms, flanked by law enforcement officers, as chaos broke out among supporters in the gallery. The image instantly went viral. For her critics, it was a fitting end to a defiant judge who had broken the law. For her supporters, it was a chilling display of what they believed was systemic injustice, one that played out in front of the entire country. Hunter served a portion of her 6-month sentence and was released early for good behavior. Upon release, she remained disbarred and ineligible to hold public office, though she continued to speak publicly about justice reform and judicial accountability. The broader impact of the case has been lasting. In Ohio, the Hunter case ignited new conversations around judicial ethics, prosecutorial discretion, and how race and politics can intersect in the legal system. It also prompted legislative proposals aimed at improving transparency in how judges are disciplined and removed from office. And within legal circles, it became a case study in how personal loyalty, even when well-intentioned, can conflict with the strict ethical boundaries judges are expected to uphold. But even today, the legacy of Tracie Hunter remains contested. Was she a rogue judge who abused her power to protect a family member? Or was she a reform-minded outsider targeted by a system uncomfortable with her presence and perspective? The truth may lie somewhere in the middle. What's clear is that her story continues to provoke strong opinions and serves as a reminder of how fragile public trust in the judiciary can be when questions of fairness, race, and power collide. And that brings us to the end of the video. Which of these cases stood out to you the most? Do you believe justice was truly served or not? Let me know your thoughts and where you're tuning in from down in the comments. If you found this video informative, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.